This is the Black Blogger, Joe Hall, and I am continuing my Black History Month salute to the work done by the Equal Justice Initiative. Now I'm going to be moving into reading the third edition of Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror. There are going to be seven parts to this reading. The Succession and Emancipation, 1861 through 1865. Back to Brutality, Chapter 2. Chapter 3, Lynching in America from Popular Justice to Racial Terror. Chapter 4, Enabling an Era of Lynching, Retreat, Resistance, and Refuge. Chapter 5, Confronting Lynching. Chapter 6, Trauma and the Legacy of Lynching. And finally, the conclusion. They'll be done in half an hour blocks over the course of the next, looks like 10 days. Introduction. Men and boys beneath the body of Lim Daniels, a black man, shortly after he was lynched August 3rd, 1920, in Center, Texas. History, despite its retching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Maya Angelou, on the pulse of the morning. During the period between the Civil War and World War II, thousands of African Americans were lynched in the United States. Lynchings were violent and public acts of torture that traumatized black people throughout the country and were largely tolerated by state and federal officials. These lynchings were terrorism. Terror lynchings peaked between 1880 and 1940 and claimed the lives of African American men, women, and children who were forced to endure the fear, humiliation, and barbarity of this widespread phenomena unaided. Lynching profoundly impacted race relations in this country and shaped the geographic, political, social, and economic conditions of African Americans in ways that are still evident today. Terror lynching fueled the mass migration of millions of black people from the South into urban ghettos in the North and West throughout the first half of the 20th century. Lynching created a fearful environment where racial subordination and segregation were maintained with limited resistance for decades. Most critically, lynching reinforced the legacy of racial inequality that has never been adequately addressed in America. The administration of criminal justice in particular is tangled with the history of lynching in profound and important ways that continue to contaminate the integrity and fairness of the justice system. This report, Lynching in America, begins a necessary conversation to confront the injustice, inequality, anguish, and suffering that racial terror and violence created. The history of terror lynching complicates contemporary issues of race, punishment, crime, and justice. Mass incarceration, excessive penal punishment, disproportionate sentencing of racial minorities, and the police abuse of people of color reveal problems in the American society that were framed during this terror era. The narrative of racial difference that lynching dramatized continues to haunt us. Avoiding honest conversation about this history has undermined our ability to build a nation where racial justice can be achieved. In America, there is a legacy of racial inequity shaped by the enslavement of millions of black people. The era of slavery was followed by decades of terrorism and racial subordination, most dramatically evidenced by lynching. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s challenged the legality of many of the most racist practices and structures that sustained racial subordination, but the movement was not followed by a continued commitment to truth and reconciliation. Consequently, this legacy of racial inequality has persisted, leaving us vulnerable to a range of problems that continue to reveal racial disparities and injustice. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that it is essential that we begin to discuss our history of racial injustice more soberly and to understand the implications of our past in addressing the challenges of the present. Lynching in America is the second of series of reports that examines the trajectory of American history from slavery to mass incarceration. In 2013, the Equal Justice Initiative published Slavery in America, which documents the slavery era and its continuing legacy, and erected 3 public markers in Montgomery, Alabama, to change the visual landscape of a city and a state that has romanticized the mid-19th century and ignored the devastation and horror created by racialized slavery and the slave trade. Over the past 6 years, the Equal Justice Initiative staff has spent thousands of hours researching and documenting terror lynchings in the 12 most active lynching states in America: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. We have more recently supplemented our research by documenting terror lynchings in other states and found these acts of violence were most common in 8 states: Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Maryland, Missouri, Ohio, Oklahoma, and West Virginia. We distinguish racial terror lynchings, the subject of this report, from hangings and mob violence that followed some criminal trial process or that were committed against non-minorities without the threat of terror. Those lynchings were a crude form of punishment that did not have the features of terror lynchings directed at racial minorities who were being threatened and menaced in multiple ways. We also distinguish terror lynchings from racial violence and hate crimes that were prosecuted as criminal acts. Although criminal prosecution for hate crimes was rare during the period we examined, such prosecutions ameliorated those acts of violence and racial animus. The lynchings we document were acts of terrorism because these murders were carried out with impunity, sometimes in broad daylight, often on the courthouse lawn. These lynchings were not frontier justice because they generally took place in communities where there was a functioning criminal justice system that was deemed too good for African Americans. Terror lynchings were horrific acts of violence whose perpetrators were never held accountable. Indeed, some public spectacle lynchings were attended by the entire white community and conducted as celebratory acts of racial control and domination. Key findings of lynching in America. Number 1, racial terror lynching was more prevalent than previously reported. The Equal Justice Initiative researchers have documented several hundred more lynchings than the number identified in the most comprehensive work done on lynching to date. The extraordinary work of E.M. Beck and Stuart M. Tonde provided an invaluable resource, as did the research collected at Tuskegee University in Tuskegee, Alabama. Those sources were widely viewed as the most comprehensive collection of research data on the subject of lynching in America. The Equal Justice Initiative conducted extensive analysis of these data, as well as the supplemental research and investigation of lynchings in each of the subject states. We reviewed local papers, historical archives, and court records, conducted interviews with local historians, survivors, and victim descendants, and exhaustively examined contemporaneously published reports in African American newspapers. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented 4,084 racial terror lynchings in 12 southern states between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and in 1950, which is at least 800 more lynchings in these states than previously reported. The Equal Justice Initiative also documented more than 300 racial terror lynchings in other states during this time period. Number two, some states and counties were particularly terrifying places for African Americans and have dramatically higher rates of lynching than other states and counties we reviewed. Mississippi, Florida, Arkansas, Louisiana had the highest statewide rates of lynching in the United States. Lafayette, Hernando, Taylor, and Baker counties in Florida, Early County, Georgia, Fulton County, Kentucky, and Lake and Moore County in Tennessee had the highest rates of terror lynchings in America. Phillips County, Arkansas, Lafourche and Tensas Parish in Louisiana, LaFour and Carroll counties in Mississippi, and New Hanover County in North Carolina were sites of mass lynchings of African Americans and single incident violence that mark them as notorious places in the history of racial terror. The largest numbers of lynchings were found in Jefferson County, Alabama, Orange, Columbia, and Polk counties in Florida, Fulton, Early, and Brooks County in Georgia, Caddo, Echuca, and Bossier, Iberia, and Takafoa parishes in Louisiana, Hinds County, Mississippi, Shelby County, Tennessee, and Anderson County, Texas. Number three, racial terror lynching was a tool used to enforce Jim Crow laws and racial segregation, a tactic for maintaining racial control by victimizing the entire African American community. Not merely punishment of an alleged perpetrator for a crime. The Equal Justice Initiative research confirms that many victims of terror lynchings were murdered without being accused of any crime, and they were killed for minor social transgressions or for demanding basic rights and fair treatment. Number four, our conversations with survivors of lynching show that terror lynching played a key role in the forced migration of millions of black Americans out of the South. Thousands of people fled to the North and West out of fear of being lynched. Parents and spouses sent away loved ones who suddenly found themselves at risk of being lynched for a minor social transgression. They characterized these frantic, desperate escapes as surviving near lynchings. Number five, in all of the subject states we observe that there is an astonishing absence of any effort to acknowledge, discuss, or address lynching. Many of the communities where lynching took place have gone to great lengths to erect markers and monuments that memorialize the Civil War, the Confederacy, and historical events during which local power was violently reclaimed by white Southerners. These communities celebrate and honor the architects of racial subordination and political leaders known for their belief in white supremacy. There are very few monuments or memorials that address the history and legacy of lynching in particular or the struggle for racial equality more generally. Most communities do not actively or visibly recognize how their race relations were shaped by terror lynching. Number six, we found that most terror lynchings can be best understood as having the features of one or more of the following. Number one, lynchings that resulted from a wildly distorted fear of interracial sex. Number two, lynchings in response to casual social transgressions. Number three, lynchings based on allegations of serious violent crime. Number four, public spectacle lynchings. Number five, lynchings that escalated into large-scale violence targeting the entire African American community. And six, lynching of sharecroppers, ministers, and community leaders who resisted mistreatment, which were most common between 1915 and 1940. Number seven, the decline in lynching in The studied states relies heavily on the increased use of capital punishment imposed by court order, followed by an often accelerated trial. That the death penalty's roots are sunk deep into the legacy of lynching is evidenced by the fact that public executions to mollify the mob continued after the practice was legally banned. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that our nation must fully address our history of racial terror and the legacy of racial inequality it has created. This report explores the power of truth and reconciliation or transitional justice to address oppressive histories by urging communities to honestly and soberly recognize the pain of the past. And as has been powerfully detailed in Cheryl Lynn's Eiffel's extraordinary book, Lynching on the Courthouse Lawn, which has been read on the Black Man's Read Aloud Hour, there is an urgent need to challenge the absence of recognition in the public space on the subject of lynching. Only when we concretize the experience through discourse, memorials, monuments, and other acts of reconciliation can we overcome the shadows cast by these grievous events. We hope that you will join our effort to help towns, cities, and states recover from tragic histories of racial violence and terrorism, and to improve the health of our community by creating an environment where there can truly be equal justice for all. Brian Stevenson, director of the Equal Justice Initiative. Chapter 1, Succession and Emancipation, 1861 through 1865. When 11 states seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America, sparking the Civil War in 1861, they made no secret of their ultimate aim: to preserve the institution of slavery. As Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens explained, the ideological cornerstone of the new nation they sought to form was that the Negro was not equal to the white man, and slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and moral condition. Slavery has been an increasingly divisive political issue for generations, and though the United States President Abraham Lincoln personally opposed slavery, he had rejected the abolitionist calls for immediate emancipation. Instead, Abraham Lincoln favored a gradual process of compensated emancipation and voluntary colonization, which would encourage free black people to immigrate to Africa. Once the nation was in the throes of civil war, Lincoln feared any federal move toward emancipation would annihilate border states that permitted slavery but had not succeeded. Lincoln's cabinet and other federal officials largely agreed, and shortly after the war's start, the House of Representatives passed a resolution emphasizing that the purpose of the war was to preserve the Union, not to eliminate slavery. As the Civil War dragged on, however, increasing numbers of enslaved African Americans fled slavery to relocate behind Union lines, and this cause of emancipation became more militarily and politically expedient. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared enslaved people residing in rebelling Confederate states to be thenceforth and forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 did not apply to the roughly 425,000 enslaved people living in Tennessee, Delaware, Kentucky, and Maryland, states that had not succeeded or were occupied by Union forces. In most Confederate states where the proclamation did apply, resistance to emancipation was inevitable, and there was almost no federal effort to enforce the grant of freedom. Southern planters attempted to hide the news about Lincoln's proclamation from enslaved people, and in many areas where Southern troops were not present, slavery remained the status quo well after 1863. Even as the Confederacy faced increasingly certain defeat in the war, Southern whites insisted that Lincoln's wartime executive order was illegal and that slavery should be formally banned only by legislative or court action. Many used deception and violence to keep enslaved people from leaving plantations. Formal nationwide codification of emancipation came in December of 1865 with the ratification of the first of the three Civil War amendments, the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery throughout the United States except as punishment for a crime. Several states continued to symbolically resist into the 20th century. The state of Delaware, the home of the current president of the United States, did not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1901. Kentucky, the home of the Bluegrass State, the home of the Kentucky Derby and the University of Kentucky's basketball, mostly all black basketball team, and Louisville University didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1976. In Mississippi, home of the University of Mississippi, mostly black football team, didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1995. The legal instruments that led to the formal end of racialized chattel slavery in America did nothing to address the myth of racial hierarchy that sustained slavery, nor did they establish a national commitment to the alternative ideology of racial equality. Black people might be free from involuntary labor under the law, but that did not mean Southern whites recognized them as being fully human. White Southern identity was grounded in a belief that whites were inherently superior to African Americans. Following the war, whites reacted violently to the notion that they would now have to treat their former human property as equal and pay for their labor. In numerous recorded incidents, plantation owners attacked black people simply for claiming their freedom, their citizenship. At the Civil War's end, black autonomy expanded, but white supremacy remained deeply rooted. The failure to unearth these roots would leave black Americans exposed to terrorism and racial subordination for more than a century. Presidential Reconstruction. The federal government's lackluster commitment to black civil rights and security following the Civil War was a disappointing failure that undermined the promise of freedom. Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau in March of 1865 with a mandate to provide formerly enslaved people with the basic necessities and to oversee their condition and treatment in the former Confederate states, but Congress appropriated no budget for the Bureau, leaving it to be staffed and funded by President Andrew Johnson's War Department. President Johnson, a Unionist former slaveholder from Tennessee, served as vice president during the Civil War and assumed the presidency, and actually he didn't serve as vice president during the entire Civil War, only the last year of the Civil War, because Abraham Lincoln changed his vice presidency in order to ensure his support from the border states. And he assumed the presidency after Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865. Though he initially promised to punish Southern traitors, Johnson issued 7,000 pardons to secessionists by 1866. He also rescinded orders granting black farmers tracts of lands confiscated from Confederates. This greatly impeded formerly enslaved people's abilities to build their own farms because whites routinely refused to provide them credit, effectively barring black people from purchasing land without government assistance. Instead of advocating black land ownership, Andrew Johnson advocated a new practice that soon replaced slavery as a primary source of Southern agricultural labor, sharecropping. Under this system, black laborers worked white-owned land in exchange for a share of the crop at harvest minus costs for food and lodging, often in the same slave quarters they had previously inhabited. Because Johnson's administration required that land owners pay off their debts to banks first, sharecroppers frequently received no pay or had no recourse. President Johnson also opposed black voting rights. During Reconstruction, whites of diverse political affiliations declared voting a privilege rather than a universal right. And even some whites who opposed slavery were wary of the measures that would lead to black voting in the North. Johnson believed black people were inherently servile and unintelligent. He feared that they would vote as instructed by their former masters, reestablishing the power of the planter class in regulating poor white farmers to virtual slavery. Johnson made little effort to disguise his racist views. In his 1867 annual message to Congress, President Johnson declared that black Americans had less capacity for government than any other race of people, and that they would relapse into barbarism if left to their own devices, and that giving them the vote would result in a tyranny such as this continent has never ever yet witnessed. Not surprisingly, under President Johnson, federal Reconstruction efforts to support and enforce black citizenship rights and social economic freedom went largely unsupported and unrealized. Meanwhile, the Johnson administration allowed Southern whites to reestablish white supremacy and dominate black people with impunity. Two incidents in 1866 foretold terrifying days to come for African Americans. On May 1st, 1866, at Memphis, Tennessee, white police officers began firing into a crowd of African American men, women, and children that had gathered on South Street, and afterward white mobs rampaged through black neighborhoods with the intent to kill every Negro and drive the last one from the city. Over 3 days of violence, 46 African Americans were killed. 2 whites were killed by friendly fire. 91 houses, 4 churches, 12 schools were burnt to the ground, and at least 5 women were raped, and many black people fled Memphis permanently. Less than 3 months later, in New Orleans, a group of African Americans, many of whom had been free before the Civil War, attempted to convene a state constitutional convention to extend voting rights to black men and repeal racially discriminatory acts known as the Black Codes. When the delegates convened at the Mechanics Institute on July 30th, 1866, groups of black supporters and white opponents clashed in the streets. The white mob began firing on black marchers, indiscriminately killing convention supporters and unaffiliated black bystanders. Rather than maintaining order, white police officers attacked black residents with guns, axes, and clubs, arresting many and killing several. By the time the federal troops arrived to suppress the white insurgency, as many as 48 black people were dead and 200 had been wounded. And that is the end of the reading for today. I will be picking up the remainder of Chapter 1, Progressive Reconstruction, tomorrow. Thank you.